Now we're going to look at the evolution of labyrinth design from some of the older historical labyrinths to contemporary ones. And we're also going to think about labyrinths in terms of their classification and families. So this is a ongoing, evolving typology that I have created based on the work of many people who have come before me, including Jeff Sayward from Labyrinthos in England, who has done probably more work than anyone and more study about the historical examples of labyrinths. So I would really encourage you to check out labyrinthos.net. And Erwin Reisman and Andreas Frey from My Maze blog have also really done incredible research in the typology and design of labyrinths. So this handout is found in the resources page of this lecture on Teachable. And now we will go through individually um, from the earliest labyrinth to some of the most modern ones. This, of course, is the classical labyrinth, which is the oldest labyrinth design, dating back 4 to 6,000 years. The earliest example and place are unknown, as I said in the opening lecture, but um, it is believed that some of these rock carvings in northern Spain, in the Mogor region, um, this image is from Mara Gataria, and it could be as old as 5,000 years, but it is very hard to trace rock carvings. So the oldest classical labyrinth that we can know for certain, its date, is this square classical labyrinth that was carved or drawn on the back of a clay tablet in Pylos, Greece. And what's fascinating is that someone was apparently accounting for sheep or goats being delivered, and on the back of the tablet doodled this labyrinth design. And maybe it was intentional instead of just a doodle, but the entire town burned down, and in the burning of the village, this clay tablet became fired and preserved. And so we can date this tablet to 1200, knowing that that's when the Great Fire happened in Pylos, Greece. So that means that the classical labyrinth is at least 3,200 years old, but very likely older. And what's interesting about the oldest forms is that they're not really walkable, at least the surviving examples we have of classical labyrinths. They are more symbolic examples, like the carving on the wall or the etching on the clay. There are also coins that had labyrinths on them, especially in um, Crete, on the island of Crete, from maybe 400 to 12 BC. There was a series of coins with labyrinths and the Minotaur and other geometric forms in the town of Knossos, Knossos. And this is a larger version of the classical labyrinth, the 11th circuit classical. And here is a postcard from the town of Visby on the island of Gotland in the Baltic Sea. And this is the 11th circuit classical labyrinth depicted in an early postcard. And this example may go back 300 to 400 years or more. And the classical labyrinth is prevalent throughout the Baltic Sea and the Mediterranean, probably moving around by way of the fishermen and trades, people trading in boats. The labyrinth can be increased to 15 circuits, and here is an example of a 15 circuit classical labyrinth, also on the island of Gotland, created by a lighthouse keeper. So a very long version of the classical labyrinth. This is a three-circuit classical labyrinth, now made with concentric circles instead of with the seed pattern. So you can see it is 4 circles create 3 circuits, and an example of the three-circuit classical labyrinth is found on the Cretan coins. And you can see this is a square version of it, but it follows the same um, path layout in terms of the entry into the circuit closest to the center and then out and meandering back in again. The same is true for the 5-circuit concentric labyrinth that meanders out and in, and this is an example of a 5-circuit square classical labyrinth on a Cretan coin. This is the Chakravaya labyrinth from India, and it is a variation on the classical labyrinth because it has only the turns at the entrance, but instead of a open center, it has a spiral center. And this is based on a design that stems out of the Hindu epic Mahabharata, which is surprisingly a defensive formation for a soldiers on horseback in the army, and you would have the captain in the center and the soldiers surrounding the captain in this formation. Here is a carving of that from a temple in Labyrinth, India, dating from the 12th century. So interesting too that it's almost from the similar time as the Chart Labyrinth, this depiction of the Chakravayu labyrinth on the temple wall in India. This is the Baltic wheel design, which introduces the idea of a processional labyrinth, meaning that you can enter into the labyrinth through one entrance, arrive in the center, and then instead of retracing your steps back out again, you can continue from a different pathway out of the center, and there is a separate exit. So it can be walked, or actually many people believe this was danced in Germany, and you could dance it in one direction to the center and then take a short exit out of the side. I like that this design also kind of looks like a tree, and so it's kind of neat that this example in Eilenrade, Hanover, Germany, which dates from at least 1642, has a tree in the center. So very beautiful rendition of this labyrinth called a rad in Germany, R-A-D, meaning wheel, so the Baltic wheel. A variation on the Baltic wheel is this Wunderkreis, which is a Baltic wheel with a double spiral center that encloses the entire center area. So instead of having an open center, it comes together into a double spiral. So the Wunderkreis example that I have is from a modern installation in Australia that I visited by Mark Healy. So you can see here this beautiful installation of it as a walkable labyrinth. This is a triple spiral labyrinth that is based on the Triskelion design that comes from Greek, kind of like the meander pattern. It was found as a Greek motif, but also in Celtic design. It is very crucial and widespread. It has 3 double spirals that together create a winding pathway that arrive at kind of a triangular center. This could be based on this triple spiral found at Newgrange, Ireland, and this rock carving dates from maybe 3,200 BC, and you can see the kind of double spiral weaving together. It doesn't particularly form the labyrinth. These aren't quite labyrinths, but they are becoming very close to them. So Tony Christie in Ireland created a labyrinth based on that Triskelion design, which he also forms into a shamrock, which is kind of a cool design. The Man in the Maze is also a classical variation found in the Native American Southwest, and it is the Ai Itoi of the Tohono O'odham tribe, and it represents the life journey. And it is a classical labyrinth, although it looks quite different. Here it looks also as if it's depicted upside down, but this is the way that the Native Americans display this design. It is a 7-circuit classical labyrinth with the addition of the turns going in and out of the center. And this, though there is no evidence that this predates contact with Europeans, so it is believed that perhaps the Spanish that came to the California and Western Americas brought the classical labyrinth that then was adapted into this symbolic design. Mostly it is not walked, but used on baskets and jewelry. So here is a basket weaving depicting the Man in the Maze from the Tohono O'odham tribe. The next family after the classical labyrinths is the Roman labyrinths that date from approximately 200 BC to 400 CE. So Roman labyrinths are kind of the next major evolution in design, and you can see a couple of things. The square pattern similar to the Cretan coins, and also the division of the labyrinth into quadrants. And what's interesting about these Roman labyrinths often is you walk one quadrant and then you proceed to the next quadrant. So you would walk the bottom right, then the bottom left, then the upper left, the top left, and then the bottom right, and then make your way to the center. Mostly the Roman labyrinths were also symbolic, not walkable, but this is an example from Coimbra, Portugal, with mosaic tiles and perhaps a minotaur or a bull head in the center of this Roman mosaic labyrinth. Now the Romans then spread the labyrinth with their empire, all the way to Portugal, into northern Africa, and throughout Europe. So, the Romans kind of helped to really spread the awareness and evidence of the labyrinth into many different places, which the cultures may have then adapted it for use as their own. Then we move to the next family, which is the medieval labyrinths. These are the labyrinths that began in 8th century manuscripts and then were installed in the cathedrals of France and England and Italy. This is the Abingdon labyrinth, which was not a walkable labyrinth, but evidence of an early manuscript labyrinth. Here is a rendition of it drawn and now is used sometimes as a 6-circuit medieval form for smaller spaces. And then here you can see it from its original manuscript with the writing throughout the pathways. And then here is the Chartres labyrinth. Of course, obviously, the probably most well-known and often replicated labyrinth. perhaps the most walked labyrinth in the world. Now we uh, have a full-size walkable labyrinth in the cathedral in France, the 11th Circuit design, which we will cover in detail in the second half of the drawing course. And the Chartres Labyrinth was one of maybe 23 different cathedrals in France and Italy from the 12th century that had labyrinths in their floors, but it is the only one of the only surviving ones with its original stone and setting. So it really helped to inspire the modern movement. And um, examples of other medieval labyrinths include this one from uh, the Saint Bertin Abbey in Saint Omer. It was installed maybe in 1350, but then destroyed in the late 18th, early 19th century. So it was rebuilt though in an abbey about half size. I mean, I guess in the original cathedral, and about half of the size of what its original form was in the mid 19th century. So this is an image of the labyrinth, but more symbolic again than a full size walkable. Although many believe that these were walked or prayed or um, used as a symbolic pilgrimage in the time of the medieval ages, although there is no real understanding or factual evidence of their exact use. This is the Reims Labyrinth, dating from 1290. Perhaps it is interesting because it has four what we call bastions, which are kind of areas, other separate centers, pausing spaces, which originally depicted the four architects in each of these four corners of the labyrinth. This also was removed in 1778 as a relic of irrational times. So during the Enlightenment, a lot of the labyrinths were removed from the cathedrals in France and Italy. This one was recreated as a projection in the same location, so you can see here it is being projected down into the floor of the cathedral. Now we're moving to the turf mazes from about 1400 to 1800. They were also called Mizmays, Troy Towns, Shepherd Races, or Caerdroea. They were historically in Northern Europe, especially in England, where 8 historic examples survive. This is the Saffron Walden Labyrinth from Essex, England, which dates from 1699. It is the largest surviving turf labyrinth in England with 17 circuits, so extremely large. And it is formed by a brick pathway in grass. So you are walking on a very narrow brick pathway in between the grass paths, and there used to be a tree in the center, but that tree did not survive, and this design could have been copied from a garden book from the 1560s that depicted a similar design. So it's 132 feet in diameter, and a really beautiful example of a turf maze or labyrinth. This is a fascinating design called the Shepherd's Race in Botton Green, Nottingham, England, which may have dated from the mid 1300s. It's fascinating because it kind of combines the classical, medieval, and the spiral center. Although there is a theory that originally the center might have been a full traditional center and then later was incorrectly made into the spiral. And, you know, with these turf labyrinths especially, it's hard to know, you know, did they evolve from their original design over time? And maybe this labyrinth has had many different designs based on who was caretaking it, and if things fell out of place, and it would had to be fixed or redesigned as over time. Unfortunately, this was destroyed in 1917 during military practice and tank runs during the World War I. Here is a example of an old maze. Since I couldn't find a picture or anything to show the shepherd's race. This is an example of another turf maze from Wing, Rutland, England. This is simply called the Old Maze, and it is a sharp design. But here you see you walk on the grass, and there is some gravel in between, separating the pathways. So now we'll begin another family of labyrinths that I call the Radial family. This is something that I've kind of come up with myself as a classification. I call the classical labyrinths are the ones that just have the turns at the entrance, and the medieval labyrinths have the turns on the axis, the left, right, top, and bottom. And then now we have these labyrinths that are divided in in fifths or thirds. This is in fifths, and it's called a Gossenbrot labyrinth, based on the humanist in Germany from 1480 that created this design in a manuscript. So it's only recently that it was made into a walkable labyrinth and refined, as you saw it on the previous image. But here is the Gossenbrot design in the manuscript that was also included, along with maybe 5 or 6 other patterns that this person created in that time. Here is another radial labyrinth that is divided into thirds, and it is a nice variation for a small space that John Ritter of Pax Works used as a story path labyrinth for children. So this is a nice design for children to use, and because it is shorter, and he also included a green dot in the center for use in godly play at his local church. Here's another radial labyrinth called the Partner Stroll, created by Lisa Moriarty in Minnesota. Lisa is one of the preeminent labyrinth designers and canvas and permanent labyrinth builders in the United States. So she created this labyrinth, which amazingly you can walk hand in hand with someone in the next path over, and you can hold hands and walk through the entire design side by side, which she demonstrated at the Florida annual gathering of the Labyrinth Society. There she is walking with Stephen Shibley through a canvas version of this pattern. Then this is a family that I call neo-medieval labyrinths, which are labyrinths that have turns on the cross or the axis, but do not exist from medieval times. So a neo-medieval labyrinth is a modern labyrinth based on the medieval form, but usually these do not have the center rosette or lunations around the outside. So this is called the Santa Rosa labyrinth, created by Leah Good Harris, and she received this labyrinth kind of energetically in March of 1997, so early in the revival of the labyrinths in the United States. And it was a really important addition at that time, because mostly it was people using either the classical labyrinth or the Chart labyrinth, and the Santa Rosa labyrinth was a new option that fell in between. It was not quite Chart related, and it was not a classical labyrinth, so it was kind of a third form. and really kind of spurred the contemporary labyrinth design movement and became a popular third option for people. You can see also this labyrinth introduces a center circle at the entrance that Leah calls the heart space, which you can place a object or something symbolic into the circle as you walk through the labyrinth as a focal point. This is called the Petite Charte, but I classify it as a neo-medieval labyrinth because it does not exist in the archetype of the charte labyrinth, so it is kind of a modern variation of the medieval form. And I like this design a lot, not as a charte replica with the lunations and rosette, but I do like it as a neo-medieval option. This one, as you enter in, it embraces the center. So you see the pathway comes in and goes right around the center, very much like the charte labyrinth. Whereas going back now to the Santa Rosa, you can see this enters in and then turns away from the center and goes outside first, which is also true for the Circle of Peace by Lisa Moriarty. And if you wanted a neo-medieval labyrinth that was closer to the charte labyrinth, then I like this Petite Charte, and this is the design that I chose to use for a outdoor public park labyrinth in Vallejo. And instead of using the charte center, I created this Seed of Life center to utilize sacred geometry in the form of a rosette, but not in the medieval rosette, in a different form. This is another family of labyrinths in the contemporary realm called processional labyrinths, and these have become very popular labyrinths that have a separate entrance and exit. That is so you can have more people walk through it without it getting crowded, people turning around and confronting each other. So you can have more people go through this labyrinth. It's easier to facilitate, and also it's a shorter walk. You can walk all the way to the exit, but then if you wanted a longer journey, you could turn around and retrace it back again. So it is a seven circuit classical labyrinth turned around and reflecting itself. So I call these mirror paths. This is a design that I created with a high school in Hawaii for a canvas labyrinth, and I like the fact that the processional labyrinth also kind of reflects the journey of moving through one phase of life into another phase. So instead of a full life journey where, the labyrinth comes full circle, I feel like these processional labyrinths are good for rituals where you are beginning a new chapter, a new phase of life. Here also is another processional labyrinth with further turns in the axis, and I created this labyrinth for an elementary school in Daly City, California, and you can see here the design, and it has two heart spaces, just like the Santa Rosa labyrinth in some ways. This has them on either side. Still working on the name for this. I think I'm going to, I don't know what I call this, the neo-medieval mirror path seven circuit design. This is a processional labyrinth called the Reconciliation Labyrinth from Cape Town, South Africa, created by artist Claire Wilson in the late 1990s, early 2000. And this Reconciliation Labyrinth is meant for work on apartheid, and the idea is that two people could walk the two different entrances of the labyrinth, left and right, enter into the labyrinth, and then kind of mirror each other's pathways, and then they come around and meet back in the entrance, and they have a decision whether or not to reconcile in the center or exit out back again. So it's kind of interesting. This Labyrinth has a choice of going in or out and never arriving at the center. Um, Here's an example of it from the Slingkop Lighthouse in 2003. This is a design called the Dual Path Heart by Marty Kermeen. It was created for the Heart in the Park installation in Tonkawa, Oklahoma in 2007. Marty Kermeen is the preeminent hand-cut paver artist, and he created this design for their Oklahoma Centennial, and it is meant to be a unique kind of roadside attraction. And here is the beautiful rendition of it in pavers that he created, which is really stunning. And it's an interesting labyrinth design that, similar to the Reconciliation Labyrinth, you enter in and have the choice to go either to the left or the right. And then when you get to the top, you would meet there above the heart shape. And then you could walk out together, or you could pass each other and then go out the opposing sides. So this begins a symbolic family of labyrinths, which are labyrinths that represent or reflect a certain symbol, like the heart or star, or this one representing kind of like an eyeball. This was created by labyrinth designer Ronald Esquivel from Costa Rica, and it's based on the vesica piscis, which is the intersection of two circles, both adjoining their center radius points. So this is what he calls the Sendero del Amor, or the Path of Love, which he created as a possible labyrinth for weddings, where a bride and groom could each walk from opposite sides and join together in the center for a ceremony, which is very beautiful. Another symbolic labyrinth by Maya Scott, an artist in San Francisco. This is her hand labyrinth, which has a Chakravayu center and extra addition of the fingers and thumb, which is actually her hand traced, and then a labyrinth created inside the handprint, which I think is really lovely. And this is an installation, handmade installation, she says, of the labyrinth using cutout hands at a festival in San Francisco. And then the last family I call the Avant-garde labyrinths, which are labyrinths that don't really fit the other categories and are really breaking with the mold of what a labyrinth is. So this is called the Meander Wand by Alex Champion, who was a prolific labyrinth designer in the 1990s to 2000s, and it has aspects of the three-circuit labyrinth and Greek meander. And he also dug these into the earth, creating mounds, so very sculptural effect in Northern California. And this is a modern contemporary avant-garde labyrinth by Tom Vetter in Minnesota, and Tom is really pushing the boundaries of what labyrinth design is, and I love his creativity. And here is a double spiral 11 circuit chart variation, a quadruple double spiral with kind of resembling a butterfly almost, and very different, something that he shared at the gathering in Hudson, Wisconsin of the Labyrinth Society. And it's always great to see what Tom is creating, and usually he paints them out at Labyrinth Society gatherings for everyone to experience. So we've gone through 30 different labyrinth designs, and the question remains, what is a labyrinth? And now we can survey the entire field of labyrinths, from the ancient archetype of the classical and medieval and Roman labyrinths to the more contemporary turf, radial, and modern labyrinths. And the truth is, there isn't one defining feature of a labyrinth. There's a series of things that come together to make something more or less labyrinthine. And so I've created this list. A somewhat typical or true labyrinth has the following characteristics. Generally, it is a single or unicursal path with no deviations or dead ends. So one path through, and you don't have to make a choice, and you don't end up stuck anywhere on the path. 2, they are created with sacred geometry, they are consistent in proportion, and have an odd number of circuits. So generally, the designs I showed you are created with geometry, and even beyond geometry, sacred geometry, reflecting symbolism and value in nature, and designs that include things like spirals, meanders, the circle, these patterns that are found throughout all of life and creation. Usually they are consistent in proportion and have an odd number of circuits. I mean, just the way that meanders work, usually you end up with 3 circuits to make a meander, and if you have a 7-circuit labyrinth, you are combining 3 or 2 3-circuit meanders to make 7. So most labyrinths are 3, 5, 7, 9, 11. The installation is 2-dimensional, so the entire design can be seen as it is walked or traced. So unlike mazes that usually have walls to further disorient the visitor or the person in the maze, labyrinths are usually flat. They're usually 2-dimensional, or if they're not flat, usually the objects are low to the ground. Or even if it's a hedge labyrinth, often the hedge labyrinth will only come up to your waist or shoulders so that you can still see over the hedge, whereas a maze hedge will usually be above your head to further disorient you. To begin, the path enters several circuits within the design for an immersive experience. So most of the labyrinths I've showed actually enter in, 2 or 4 circuits before they make their first turn. And this allows you to really engage into the sacred space. So you don't immediately begin on an outer pathway, walking kind of the outside of the labyrinth. You begin by engaging into the center, or at least into the a few circuits of the space. Paths are consistent in width, narrow but suitable for walking. So most labyrinths have the same path width throughout the entire design, and usually it's about between 1 foot or 2 to 3 feet. In a drawing, there's not a body width, but still they're narrow. You're not drawing designs that are extremely wide with their pathway. Usually the pathways are somewhat narrow, and the centers are usually a single path width, or 3, 5 path widths, maybe 7 path widths wide. There's a rhythmic ebb and flow towards and away from the center, a meander, so the labyrinth brings you to the center and then brings you away from the center and then brings you back in, and that is the meander pattern. The basic elements and path that arrive at the center are balanced and symmetrical. So this means that, in general, the center is centered. So there's 3 circuits on either side of the center. There's not 5 circuits on one side of the center and 2 circuits on the other. The other thing is the turns are also balanced. So like on the Shard Labyrinth, you have 3 turns on the left and 3 turns on the right. It would be imbalanced to have 1 turn on the left and 3 turns on the right, or even to have 1 turn on the left and 2 turns on the right. Generally one side reflects the other, maybe not symmetrically, but at least in number. And then finally, the center is where you arrive, usually halfway on your journey. So most labyrinths lead to a center, and usually that is about halfway through the design. Now, of course, we've seen examples here that, the Baltic wheel, you arrive at the center at the end of the path, and it does not retrace its steps. So for every single one of these aspects, some of these labyrinths are going to break that rule. Now, the thing is that they probably are only going to break one or two of these rules. But if you have a labyrinth that, has an even number of circuits, it is imbalanced in its turns, it has dead ends, then it's going to be less like a labyrinth and more like something else, like a maze or some other sort of design or pattern. So, generally, the more of these aspects the labyrinth reflects, the more labyrinthine, typical, true, or archetypal it's going to be. And the fewer aspects that a labyrinth reflects, the less labyrinthine it's going to be. And ultimately, my caveat is this: the labyrinth is really about the experience. It's not about the design. So, it's kind of like art in that when you see art, what defines something as being art is not the object itself, it's the experience that the art engenders. So the same thing is true for labyrinths. If you walk a labyrinth and it feels labyrinthine to you, then it is a labyrinth. And if it's not, then it's not. And that means that everybody can have their own definition of what a labyrinth is. And for some people, this might feel like a labyrinth, and for other people, it might feel like something else. So we're all open and able to have our own understanding of what a labyrinth is, and that is a good question for you as you create and experience these different designs in the workshop. Is, does this feel like a labyrinth to me? Is this a labyrinth that resonates with me? And then also, what sort of energy, feelings, experience does the labyrinth engender? And that's really interesting to study. So, good luck on your journey, and I'll see you in the next lecture.